Okay, so for a third chunk of lecture about the Protestant Reformation, in the previous one I talked about magisterial reformers. These are sort of the top-down people, both intellectually and politically. The political powers are very important to where you do and don't get a Protestant Reformation. The other side, though, is that you get the radical reformers. And the radical movement really starts very early on with some of Luther's students who are taking his ideas, and the mark of the radical reformers compared to the magisterial reformers is that they take Luther's ideas and the sola scriptura idea, and they conclude from it that the whole Constantinian idea of the church as a dominant institution in society is a bad idea. Okay, that's kind of basically where they go. They break with the idea that Christianity is something which is supposed to work in coordination and in support of worldly secular ruling powers. Okay, the radical reformers reject that idea. They take sola scriptura, right? The Bible alone is the authority, and when they read their Bible, they see give Caesar what's Caesar's, give God what's God's, which means what is God's is not Caesar's, right? They look at passages that say things, sort of tell Christians to anticipate persecution, and they say, oh, if you're not getting persecuted, how Christian are you really? If you've got ruling powers supporting you. They look at passages that say things like narrow is the gate and few are those who find it, right? In other words, most people in society are not really going to be Christian. So they say, okay, why pretend that we're going to have this institution that's going to embrace all of society? We're really supposed to be this small band of brothers, off on the margins over on the side from society. So radicals just kind of reject that identification of the Christian religion with society at large and with the sort of powers and institutions of society. Among the radicals, you will get basically a revolutionary branch and you'll get a pacifistic branch. Okay, the revolutionary branch is first manifested in what's called the Peasants' Revolt, starting in 1525. Luther had been condemned in 1521, so this is like really, really, really soon after. The 95 Theses have been published 1517. By 1521, Luther is condemned. By 1525, you got a peasants' revolt. There's been peasant revolts in Europe before. Peasants will revolt. People will revolt when they've been pushed too hard, when they've been, treated harshly and exploited, and when they feel that it's become, more worth their while to run the risk of a revolt than to keep on putting up with what the people in power are doing to them. You get revolts. So the Peasants' Revolt breaks out in Germany in 1525, but what's new about it is you've got people organizing it and inspiring it who are students of Luther's, who are going out there, and the application that they have drawn from Luther and the Sola Scriptura and all this is that the alliance of church, the old Catholic alliance of church with rulers, is a bad idea. It's oppressive to the people. That Christians should be free from trying to justify themselves and achieve righteousness through works, and therefore the reform that's needed is not just a reform of people's devotional practices or their theological beliefs. You need to overhaul society, right? The new gospel calls for the overthrow of oppressive lords. And so the Peasants' Revolt, saying God is on their side and this is what they're going to do. This terrifies the nobles of Germany. The Peasants' Revolt just spreads across wide swaths of Germany. You get bloody battles being fought between gatherings of peasants and the lords gathering their armies and moving to crush them. Luther himself is horrified by all this. He's really... although he's a religious reformer, he's a very traditionally minded kind of a guy in a lot of ways. He's interested in the theological switch and sola scriptura and, not following the Pope and salvation by grace alone, but he's not really interested in social change. He's generally pretty conservative on that. Luther writes a treatise and preaches a sermon that's against the murderous, ravaging hordes of peasants. Just absolutely not at all complimentary or sympathetic to the peasants' plights, but saying, they ought to go home and submit and, do what they ought to do, and calls upon the nobles of Germany, if the peasants will not submit, then they're not only in rebellion against you, they're in rebellion against God, and you should just go ahead and, massacre them. So Luther is not at all on board with this kind of political implication that some of his students were drawing from his teaching. Even more drastic in some ways is what happens in the city of Munster. Munster is over in the west of Germany, and again, some of Luther's students and people who have been reading his treatises kind of gather there. This is a little bit later, it's like in the 1530s. I think it's 1534, 35, around then. But you get this like prophecy, right? Once you sort of opened up this whole idea of, you know, the old traditional institutional authority is in question, you'll get some people saying, I've got revelations from God, I'm having visions. And some of them will be apocalyptic. That is to say, they're thinking about the end of the world and the coming of heaven, and, you know, everything's going to change and a final judgment's going to occur. And you'll get this group, the Munster prophets. It's a little bit can be a little bit confusing because the leader among them is a guy named Thomas Munzer. So it's like Munzer at Munster. You know, Munster is the city. Thomas Münster is the guy who is like sort of the leading guy of the Munster prophets, who are predicting that Christ is going to come again. He's going to return to earth. He's going to judge everybody. He's going to, you know, overthrow all the oppressors. And the city of Munster is where it's all going to begin. You know, Munster is going to be ground zero for the apocalypse. So all true believers should gather at the city of Munster and be ready there. And they wind up coming in and taking over the city. They kick out the bishop, they kick out the lords, they set up their own government, or sort of, for a while. And Munster sort of becomes, for the sort of brief moment, this like, you know, cult community kind of a thing of all these people who are like waiting for the end of the world to arrive. Meanwhile, again, all the lords and governments and authorities are, you know, shocked by this, gather their armies, besiege the city. You have a totally bloody siege. There are massacres. Munster itself, the prophecies get weirder and weirder and weirder. Society starts collapsing. You start getting cannibalism and, you know, massacres and purges and all these things happening, and eventually just sort of ends this great bloodbath that destroys the city. So you get this kind of violent radicalism, you know, on the one hand, this revolutionary thing at Munster and in the Peasants' Revolt. It kind of burns itself out, right? You know, precisely by virtue of being violent, it tends to attract counter-violence from the authorities that then, you know, winds up defeating it. The other branch of radicalism is this pacifistic tradition. It's a tradition of withdrawal from the world that emerges. There's a guy named Menno Simons, Dutch guy who sort of adopts this. And he is also taking up this idea that the new Reformation calls for, you know, freedom of the believer, and therefore you are more independent of worldly authorities. But his approach is that doesn't mean you revolt and overthrow them, and you're not going to call for an apocalypse where you're going to take over a city and expect Jesus to come and, you know, massacre all the bad guys. Instead, what he thinks is you need to, excuse me, withdraw. The institutions of government and power are fundamentally corrupted. Excuse me. They're fundamentally sinful. So what a true believer needs to do is withdraw from them. Okay? His group, there's a number of sort of different groups with, like, the Mennonites are named for Menno Simons, and they still exist as a branch of Christianity. There's broader groups that are called Anabaptists. Some of their markers, they will not baptize their children. Okay, they believe in adult baptism. That's kind of significant because baptism traditionally is the sacrament that indicates when a person becomes a member of the Christian community. Ever since the Roman Empire, baptism had traditionally been administered to children with the idea that, you know, Christian parents give birth to children, you baptize them, and the children now belong to the religious community. For Simmons and people, though, for the Anabaptists, the idea is that the Christian community is not a community that's the same as the family community or the sort of public social community. It's a separate group of people who actually believe, and so you have to wait until somebody is old enough to decide they actually believe in the gospel and are willing to commit to it, and only then do you baptize them. So they're called Anabaptists because a lot of them, Anabaptist means baptizing again. Because a lot of them had, of course, been baptized as infants in the previous, you know, order of society, but now they're saying, no, it's only adult baptism that counts. So they're baptizing people as adults, so it's a second baptism, in a sense. Okay, so you get the Anabaptist type of groups. Another thing that they will do is, with a sort of idea of withdrawal from the sort of general society, they will refuse to do things like take oaths, right? There's a passage in the Bible where Jesus says, don't swear by anything, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Well, so much of law and loyalty, vassalage, political order, social hierarchies, all these things, marriage have been sort of built on the taking of oaths. Put your hand on a Bible when you're in a law court and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth. The Mennonites and the other Anabaptists will refuse to do that, right? Because they're like, this is contradicting the word of Christ, and this is sort of entangling yourself in institutions of power by sort of swearing to uphold them and swearing your loyalty to them, which, a Christian can't do that. A Christian has to be separate from all that. Military service, likewise. I said this is a pacifistic thing, which also entails vows. The Anabaptists will sort of refuse to be recruited into or serve or get drafted into the militaries at the time and sort of stand apart. And all this means they tend to get persecuted, both by Roman Catholics and by other Protestants, who will see this as a threat to the idea of Christian society itself, right? Your magisterial reformers on the Protestant side, and certainly still Roman Catholics, are still running on the idea that there's such a thing as a Christian society. And even in its pacifistic form, this Anabaptist model of withdrawal of society, criticism of this, refusal to participate in the oath-taking and the military service and the other kind of business of secular society really seems kind of threatening to social order. So this becomes sort of a minority. They find some corners of the world, Bohemia and the Netherlands, where you'll find these groups that are tolerated. But in a lot of areas, they're really not very welcome and wind up being persecuted by various means.